All right, awesome. So, today, Exalted Subjects Studies in the Making of Race and Nation in Canada by Sunera Thobani. So this text is really good for a number of reasons that I'll kind of get into. But the title shouldn't really turn anyone off. Like, it's about Canada specifically, but it has applications all over the globe, certainly with what we're seeing today, even though it was written almost 20 years ago now, actually. But before we get into that, this can be found on Podbean, iTunes, Spotify for podcast searchers. Also, my Patreon is up there, and I have to say that we've met the goal of $12 a month, which would cover having the podcast servers up there, which is really cool. I also set a bunch of goals that I think are quite funny. So even if you don't want to contribute, I think that they're worth looking at just because, I don't know. If we ever did get to those goals, funny things will happen. Anyways, what else? Is there anything else? No. All right, let's just get into it. So I should say something about the title here. That is exalted subjects. So exalted subjects, I'll just say off the bat, are subjects that are kind of praised. Subjects that are made to be kind of extraordinary in a good way. So she's talking about those subjects that are considered to be, proper, excellent, deserving of a kind of praise on the national stage. So this subject for Thobani, that is the exalted subject, essentially enjoys most of the benefits that the state procures, kind of allows them to have. Now, in contrast to that, or in distinction, there is what exists the outsider, what is often called, the other. And that pretty much sets the stage for how she wants to look at this, where there are, the in-exalted group and then the out, unexalted or kind of lamentable group. But this is primarily ironic for Thobani because it is on the labor, often slave labor, of many of these quote-unquote others that made the nation possible. In many cases, the state that we are talking about. And this applies to a number of different nations. But specifically, if we take Canada, some of the various people that, or various racialized groups that Thobani comes to talk about, like Asian Canadian people who were instrumental in essentially uniting Canada, but then suffered pretty terrible treatment from, the Second World War onwards, and even before then, so I shouldn't temporalize it like that. Or Indigenous people, who are obviously here first, not to mention, just the way that so many other racialized groups are treated poorly in Canada. They, in many cases, made the state possible, the Canadian state possible. So it's ironic for her that there was somehow in that move a refusal to acknowledge that work, a refusal to acknowledge that kind of proprietary aspect of it, that is, the people who worked on it somehow weren't given any kind of claim to it, while the, outsider colonizing, European white person was able to garner all of this kind of status. So this sets up the major question of the book that she sets out, and that is how, despite the current exalted subjects beginning as immigrants, that is, colonizers in many cases, how did they become exalted subjects? Now, this question is important because it kind of sets the stage for her delineating, that is, kind of illustrating how those people that aren't considered exalted, i.e. those people that are considered others, how they are constructed in the kind of Canadian national imaginary. So one example, and this is certainly something that I think anyone could relate to, not in that they've experienced it, but that they've seen it, when outsiders do something quote-unquote wrong. Let's take a very violent example, well, very violent, a racist trope that Asian people are not good at driving, which is ridiculous, right? Obviously. So when someone happens to be driving and they see someone being a bad driver, what they then say, if they're oh, well, it might be, so-and-so person, if that turns out to be true, surely just a coincidence, but then that comes to be the image of the entire group, which then stands in for that entire group, which serves as a kind of feedback loop where your impression of that group is then affirmed and confirmed, therefore kind of in a snowball effect or in a continual kind of inert way, keeps enforcing that very same idea. Now, if we think about something in the opposite way, where a racialized group is essentially someone within that group does something like excellent, then it is seen only as an individual case. Then it is seen almost like an exception, because all outsiders are considered, prima facie, that is right off the bat, considered to be, incompetent, backwards, uncivilized. Now, because of the giant enterprise that exaltation can be said to kind of procure or kind of motivate, what we can then come to see is a general kind of naturalization of this process, where we are seeing, or where we will see, that these things are just taken to be like myths, an idea that she kind of brings up here that comes out of the work of Roland Barthes, who talks about myths becoming naturalized, things that we take to be just regular, run-of-the-mill, everyday things, but that with a kind of specific scope or specific lens, what he calls a kind of mythology, the study of myths, we can actually discover that there's nothing natural behind it, that they are constructed things. And in this process, the other is kind of galvanized. They're kind of concretized in an image of being often, as I mentioned, kind of uncivilized, backwards, barbaric, really terrible things, precisely because of this naturalization process. And there is also another strategy behind this, and it is also to kind of erase the messed up past that a nation like Canada has. Some of those things including, residential schools and the very deliberate spreading of disease across, indigenous populations. Internment camps of Asian Canadian people or Chinese Canadian people, I think specifically, and Japanese Canadian people, that really, trouble the idea of Canada as this kind of magical, multicultural nation. Now, this process isn't always so neat. And what I mean by that is it's not like a singular kind of locus of kind of power that does this project of exaltation. It is always changing and it's always in flux. That is, it's always kind of adapting to new trends, especially when there are different people coming from different parts of the globe with different values. The narrative needs to be kind of coordinated to kind of demonize certain subjects in certain ways, or to exalt some subjects in some ways. So when Donald Trump says, or puts forward that kind of specific immigration test, the one that, valued people that would essentially be coming from Europe, what he is doing is just like a big dog whistle, is saying, hey, what we really want are other white people to show up here. What we don't want are people from, mostly Muslim countries. Or in Canada, to be relevant to what Thobani is talking about, Quebec just passed a new set of kind of questions that immigrants are to pass in order to, be allowed into Quebec, which are super problematic, and they include like one's capacity to speak speak French, but another one is like, do you believe in certain rights and values and all this that are supposed to be in keeping with, like, in this case, Quebec's kind of identity as a province or nation? It's a joke. But what that serves to do is to kind of allow Quebec to retreat into a kind of mythic zone where they can say, we have these values. And we know we have these values because we know to test people if they share these values in order to let them in. So it says we have this vetting process, and no one who doesn't share these values is allowed in. So that kind of erases the fact that most of the people in Quebec do not share many of the values. Like, one of the questions goes almost as follows: Do you believe in like equality between, men and women when there are so many, quote unquote, like Quebec-born people that don't believe this? And this isn't specific to Quebec, obviously. It's just this happens to be a kind of topical thing with their current laws being passed, their current kind of rules, which is why I'm using them as an example. But what it serves to do is erase the fact that these very same problems can be observed among nationals, which is a very effective way of erasing that responsibility, of making it no longer a problem of people that exist here or that are born here, what Thobani calls the exalted subjects, and to then transpose that to kind of move that problem onto immigrants, which, for lack of a better word, is simply just a kind of scapegoat thing. So then any problems that come about can then be transferred onto immigrants. Or take, for instance, for anyone who's a hockey fan, would have heard Don Cherry is, if you don't know, in Canada, there's a sports segment every Saturday that includes an old coach. They're two old coaches. They aren't like, one of them's old, but they used to be, they were coaches a few years ago. And the other night, so last Saturday, I guess, one of them said, last Saturday from the time I'm recording this, so I don't know, a few Saturdays ago by the time this comes up, one of them said that people coming to this country don't wear poppies, and that he sees the fact that so many people come here and expect to be treated with what he called like milk and honey, to be kind of welcomed with open arms, and they can't even donate a couple dollars to wear a poppy. Now, poppy, if you don't know, is a symbol for fallen soldiers in World War. It represents both World Wars, but fallen soldiers that gave their lives for quote unquote, Canada. We know how much Canada was under threat. So what this kind of, I guess, points to is a few things, actually. Firstly, it suggests that immigrants are visible. So when he says, I see people out there that come here that don't wear poppies, he's pretty much saying all immigrants are people of color. Now, that's a big problem, because that's obviously not true. And what it serves to do is to kind of reinforce the idea that immigrants are of color and Canadians are white, neutral, white, essentially invisible, right? Exalted subjects can disappear into their surroundings, while immigrants are always marked by their identities. Now, the second aspect of this is that it totally erases the fact that there are so many Canadian-born people that choose not to wear poppies, but they are not criticized in the same way. Why? Who knows? I mean, the easy answer would be this guy just hates immigrants and just sees a good opportunity to kind of push his anti-immigrant agenda, which seems very obvious, very likely. But the kind of undercurrent of that is that it's not even seen, right? This person might not even know that that is what is going on because it's just naturalized. But anyways, that was kind of a digression, but in my effort to kind of illustrate this. So there are the echoes of Michel Foucault's work here, where when Foucault talks about subjectivity and the way that different modes of power emerge to kind of control populations, we can kind of get the sense that Thobani's work applies to that, because she's talking about essentially control over populations and the construction of a specific kind of in-group identity. But Thobani wants to be careful, because in Foucault, he doesn't give a whole lot of space to the study of of racialized bodies. So for him, when he writes something about biopower being the desire to kind of promote or maintain control, not by killing people, but by, essentially proliferating them, by controlling them as populations that grow, Thobani says that might apply to, some groups, but there are still so many groups that are marked and identified because of their their race, their heritage, nationality, anything like that. And because of that, they don't get to necessarily just be controlled through kind of proliferation. They are still exerted upon as though there was still what Foucault called sovereign power. So that is the idea that there is like a single point of power that exerts its influence over people, and often does this through disciplinary sanctions, does it through kind of spectacular methods of torture or punishment or anything like that. And we can see that with the example that I just gave of that hockey commentator who essentially on this national stage is calling out immigrants, essentially calling out people who aren't white because he can see them. He knows what they look like. So there's kind of a replication of that sovereign authority. So when Foucault describes the transition from sovereign power to a kind of biopower, Thobani says, okay, that's all well and good, but it forgets to include the fact that there are so many people that aren't pushed into that stage, so many people that remain marked and that suffer for it. So it's because of that she kind of falls back upon the work of Akil Mbembe, who it might be Achille Mbembe. It's one of those names I never learned how to pronounce, unfortunately, whose idea about necropolitics she finds much more germane. That is much more relevant because it specifically deals with how there is still a desire to punish, to kill in many ways, immigrant people. And there are so many explicit examples of this, of, shooters, including in Quebec with a mosque shooting that happened, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago, that killed quite a few people. That is very much an example, not of biopower, but what Mbembe says is a kind of necropower or necropolitics. That is politics exerted through the act of killing. And this is only intensified when we consider kind of Canada's foreign policy, where I've known a number of people in the military who've told me horror stories of stuff that goes on overseas. We don't have to get too much into that. So the project for her is to challenge exaltation. And it is only if we challenge this kind of idea will it be possible for us to move past it as an oppressive institution, oppressive of indigenous people, of racialized people, of immigrants, so that we can move to a more equitable, fair, Canadian identity, Canadian nation, if that's even possible, especially if we consider various indigenous responses to that sentiment. That is, Canada does not exist for many indigenous people because, that is a name imposed upon their land that they do not share. And that will kind of that'll come up in various moments throughout this book. But now that propels us here into chapter 1, that is the founding of a lawful nation. So she says that despite the kind of claim to lawfulness, despite the claim to a kind of reasonable superiority on the part of the European immigrants, quote-unquote colonizers, not quote-unquote, colonizers, Thobani identifies correctly that they were surprisingly lawless, in that they were surprisingly reckless in the way that they decimated the land in what is now known as Canada, and decimated and essentially massacred the people that were living here. And what is more strange for her is that almost in this process of violent colonization, the violence seems to be justified. It seems to be rendered justifiable, or in her words, reasonable. So how does that happen? How can violence somehow become reasonable? Well, she says that it was made to be reasonable because part of the motivation behind European colonization was, the idea of the divine right, or the kind of manifest destiny. Now, I know that doesn't apply to the colonizers, that's specific to the U.S., but it was embedded in their minds that the project was to spread. Now, to spread so that they could attain more resources, so that they could find new trading routes, so that they could, essentially expand their territory, but also because they had, good old God on their side. And when they could justify their actions because they had this transcendent being telling them what to do, or they were proclaiming that they were doing it in the word or in the name of God, then, my God, there is no limit to the amount of suffering you can inflict. I mean, that is what the Middle Ages certainly tells us about torture methods and whatnot. If God tells you to do something, very few people would want to say no, because it's God. So it's in that way that the colonization process is inscribed with a kind of truthfulness, a kind of truth, that justifies it, and that in the mind of the colonizers makes it reasonable, makes it justified. So one example would be, the Enlightenment thinker John Locke, who pretty much said, you look at all this land over there. Like, it would be a sin for us not to essentially use that land, use the soil, this God-given soil that is over there, that is not inhabited. Of course it was, but it's just not being used to the potential it can be. Of course, with little understanding at all of traditional indigenous practices in relation to the land that vary, I should say, across different indigenous nations and tribes. But just saying, let's just go over there and take it. Why not? So one figure that she draws upon to kind of make this case is Giorgio Agamben. So for anyone that's not familiar, Giorgio Agamben is kind of made famous for a few different key concepts. There's what he calls the state of exception that comes out of, I think out of Benjamin first, maybe. I don't want to screw that up, but I might have. Baudrillard talks about it even before Agamben, but he doesn't get credit for it. But yeah, Agamben's kind of famous for this idea of the state of exception, where the law can kind of be suspended in the cases of national security threats or something, where the law can be suspended and people can be, incarcerated without due process, or, killed without due process or anything like that. But he's also kind of made famous for another key concept that is a title of one of his books, and that is Homo Sacer. Now, Homo Sacer roughly translates into sacred human. Now, this sacred human is someone that is both kind of exalted, that is, they are cherished, they're kind of seen as being worthy of a kind of status in that system, but is also a person that it has to be put to death. And I read a little bit of ambiguity in this, because it's been a while since I've read that book, but this person isn't to be put to death in a kind of ritualistic manner. They aren't supposed to be sacrificed, but they're supposed to be seen as a kind of exception to all rules of normal, death putting or kind of execution killings, so that they're kind of seen beneath all life to some extent, what he kind of calls a bare life. That is, you are the absolute minimum of what it means to be human. So Thobani uses this idea to suggest that indigenous people were kind of rendered this homo sacer, that is, people that were kind of rendered sacred, and there was a kind of they were kind of fantastical to the Europeans, because they had a very different relationship to the divine, if we could call it that, and the earth, that I think in some sense the European people were kind of jealous of. Because for them, these people had a more, I guess, what I would call natural or a more intimate connection with their surroundings than the Europeans did. I'm not saying this is true. I'm just saying this is what I believe they were, thinking at that time. So in that way, they were both, the indigenous people to the Europeans were both perceived as a threat and also a point of fascination. So that presented a problem for the Europeans, because if they just simply killed off the people indiscriminately, which they still did, but Thobani says that would be too overt. That would present too much of a problem for the kind of European superior, reasonable, kind of God-driven ideals that supposed to point to the fact that you aren't supposed to kill people. So what they alternatively did was then supposedly or ostensibly benevolently added indigenous people into like the law, which only served, and this is the kind of roots of the kinds of policies we see being passed today, or in operation today, that disenfranchise indigenous people, but in a quote-unquote humane way. So she kind of takes a step back here and says that colonization, or this process, happens in kind of 3 steps. So the first step is the founding violence, that is the kind of first contact that normally results in people dying. In the case of Canada, that was the kind of literal killing of indigenous people. The second step is authorizing authority. So that is the idea of justifying a kind of domination over indigenous people. So that is with the ideas of like divine right and the law. And then the secular state apparatus supposedly follows, or that is, it's effective because it then claims to be not... Sorry, let me rephrase that. The secular state apparatus is introduced because then they can lay claim to the fact that these acts are committed on behalf of reason, not a kind of divine authority that is outside of the realm of all reason and that we can't actually appeal to, which only serves to justify these acts further. And then thirdly and finally, Thobani suggests that the process of colonization then kind of comes down to maintaining that authority, or maintaining sovereignty, sorry. So this is essentially done by casting, in the case of indigenous people, casting them to reserves, kind of taking them out of the picture. Also by inscribing laws that were written so as to strip many indigenous people of their status as indigenous. And this is especially effective against, or this has been especially effective to disintegrate matriarchal indigenous nations. So this is how the laws roughly go in Canada. If an indigenous woman marries a non-indigenous man, she loses her status as indigenous, which is messed up. So those people are no longer recognized as indigenous under the law. So therefore they lose a number of benefits that weren't great in the first place, but they were still benefits. Now, let me double check this. So I believe then how it goes is that if a non-indigenous woman marries an indigenous man, then she actually gains indigenous status, which is absurd. Like, it's absolutely absurd that is how it's conducted for a number of different reasons. Like, it hinges all kind of indigenous identity upon men, which is messed up, obviously, especially because many indigenous groups do not necessarily ascribe to, the gender binary in the way that, the white European settlers still do. And it makes it so that all of those indigenous communities that were essentially constructed around matriarchal structures then find it so much more difficult because so many more women are denied their status as indigenous. So as a kind of an aside that Thobani brings up is the work of Daniel Francis and I believe Gerald Visitor as well, who write about certain indigenous issues, specifically the kind of romanticization of indigenous people. So this kind of goes as follows, that indigenous people somehow kind of magically have a more intimate connection to the land and to nature and all that. And so this kind of sprouts the idea of what Daniel Francis calls the imaginary Indian, where there's an kind of image embedded in the national imaginary that is indigenous people are supposed to be, wearing or clad in kind of robes and headdresses and stuff, where he describes a moment, it's been a few years since I've read it, where he walks into like an indigenous, I think it's like a gift shop or something, and he sees a number of indigenous people just dressed in like jeans and, plaid shirts. And he had a moment there when he was like, wait a second, I thought indigenous people were supposed to, be kind of dressed in the way I just described, which was kind of he had a crisis at that moment where he was like, how How has the image I have of Indigenous people been crafted by a certain agenda? And this is motivated by all the history books that we get in high school in Canada and the United States as well, that always depict Indigenous people as these kinds of like, land-faring, nomadic, peaceful yet mysterious people. And it's all just a big, hoax, essentially, that is meant to kind of feed into this imaginary ideal. But anyways, that's kind of an aside that she brings up. And that puts us here into now chapter 2, which is titled Nationals, Citizens, and Others. So this chapter gets at the idea of Canada as a kind of multicultural, cosmopolitan hotbed for hospitality, which you will obviously say is not the case. So the first thing she does is trouble the idea that immigrants are strangers to what is, the metropolitan kind of metropole, or the kind of main base. There's another word for it, but it's escaping me. Where she says that in so many cases, most of the immigrants that come to various countries are coming from places that these very countries colonized. So some examples: how France colonized Algeria, how the British colonized India, Pakistan. There are a number of immigrants from there, and it goes on and on, because many of these people adopt that language, and so they're like, well, if I'm going to go anywhere, I'm going to go to the place that I have at least the language with. So she wants to firstly say that the difference that we've constructed between so-called national exalted subjects and others, immigrants, is mostly imaginary, precisely because of the kind of tumultuous history of colonization. And she furthers this by saying that, kind of affirming what I said earlier, that immigration seems to only become a problem in the minds of, so-called nationals, or people that exist in various countries, when the people coming are not of the same color as them. So when people in the United States talk about illegal immigration, everyone knows they're not talking about, that student from, the Netherlands that overstayed their visa. They're talking about Mexicans. They're talking about people from Muslim countries, precisely because those are the people they see day to day, when in fact so many of these people aren't illegal. It's just kind of assumed that people that can be seen on the basis of their skin or their dress or anything are then marked as such. And it is only at that moment that immigration becomes a problem. Where there was no problem with quote unquote immigration when it was transporting black slaves from Africa to the United States for cheap, free labor, there was no problem there. So it doesn't seem to be a problem necessarily about people coming in. It seems to be a problem whether or not those people are going to be essentially comply to a kind of image associated with them. But that's wrong. I should rephrase that. It seems a lot less as though it has to do with immigration, and it seems a lot more to do with these people not doing things for essentially Americans, that is, being slaves. And of course, no surprise, Thobani says that this has a very smooth connection to white supremacy. And then there's the idea of the kind of model minority. So I kind of struggle with this idea because it can fall into racism pretty quickly. And this is the idea that that people come from other nations and that kind of overtly engage in the kind of national display of patriotism, or patriotism is a good one, in order for them to demonstrate a kind of inness, a kind of belonging to that identity. Now, what will often come with this, or not often, sometimes come with this, is immigrant people hating then other immigrant people. if they fail to do the same things. Now, there's a problem with that, even though there might be some like quote unquote truth to it, because it essentially casts like immigrant or these so-called model minorities as just being like unconscious, essentially stupid subjects that just engage in the kind of artificial national identity that us critical, smart people know is a total farce. Where for a lot of these people, it's a survival tactic, because if they don't do that, they are going to be, called out. They are going to be the target of like attacks on, the internet or on any other kind of, or in any other way that they really can't do with. So on the one hand, it's something to be critical of, but at the same time, we have to be careful when we talk about it in those terms. But all this to say that for Thobani, it's not unlikely that this idea of the national identity can be seen as a kind of carrot on the end of the stick, or a kind of point to arrive at for a lot of immigrant people. And she worries that what might come with this is a kind of enforcement of that very oppressive system. So there's also the perception that the other, the quote-unquote other, is also taking over in other ways. So to kind of remain with Canada here, there's a lot of fear that China is taking over Vancouver. So for those that aren't familiar, Vancouver is on the west coast of Canada, and it has a lot of problems with like housing, which is not surprising because like any other city, except it seems cities in Quebec have very big problems with housing, where rent prices are inordinate. So people are blaming in Vancouver, some people, I'm not saying everyone, are blaming the fact that Chinese people are coming in and buying all these properties and then raising the prices, making it difficult for people to live there. When in fact, this is happening all over the place, and it has to do a lot more with Canada's like refusal to regulate, rent prices, and refusal to, actually step in with that, because landowners are the one that make all the money, and it's ridiculous. Like what people pay for like basement apartments in like crappy cities in Canada is absurd, except for Montreal, really, and other cities in Quebec, because they have specific kind of like unions, but like apartment or renters unions or something that really make sure that none of that happens, where a landlord can't just increase the price, double it as soon as tenants leave for the next tenants. So immigration was a very hard thing to do for a long time for people, precisely because many of these fears. And then there was introduced what she calls the point, or what was called the point system in Canada. And then in the 60s, there was introduced what was called the point system. So the point system kind of broke down various different possible qualities of prospective immigrants. So like work experience, education, language skills, family status, stuff like that would essentially, depending on how far you were in any of those things, would give you points. So, and if you had a certain number of points, you were then eligible to immigrate to Canada, which made it to some extent easier for people to come in, which might seem like, oh wow, okay, that's a good thing then. It was transforming, the way that people saw immigrants. Where Thobani wants us to kind of hit the brakes on that and say, whoa, let's also look at what's going on around that time. You had things like, well, actually, no, I won't go into that. But for Thobani, it was specifically the fact that many corporations were looking for workers. And what better way to get, free, cheap labor than to sell the idea, you get to come, to this amazing, quote unquote, place, quote unquote, amazing place. And then, we'll give you a few bucks if you work in, this factory here for cheap. So that was obviously a tactic motivated by the kind of growing corporate interest that was influencing the Canadian political scene. But of course, that was met with a lot of resistance by many Canadians, where a lot of Canadians then saw, and even me saying this, Canadians, who are these Canadians? But I'm doing it in quotes. These Canadians saw immigrants as being a threat, like the kind of same sentiment that goes around everywhere today. Immigrants are taking our jobs, where the problem is never corporations are influencing the way that policy is being made to make it so that people work for nothing, and the two people vying, that is struggling for the $7 an hour job, hate each other and don't hate the person that is, essentially motivating them to be struggling for this less than poverty line job. And that kind of moves us smoothly here into chapter 3 that is dealing with the welfare of nationals. So we all know how the quote unquote welfare state is treated as far as the economic aspect goes. So this should be no surprise that the welfare state that kind of emerged around the same time might have appeared to be beneficial to disenfranchised people, but in fact, wasn't, obviously. So ultimately, what the welfare system did for Thobani, and this is on 106, the welfare state increased the legitimacy of the state, stabilized the capitalist system, and weakened class solidarity among the proletariat. Now, this also had the added consequence of instilling in the minds of so-called Canadians or nationals that they were paying for disenfranchised people. So immigrants, criminals, people suffering with mental disease or addiction or stuff like that. Canadians then felt like they were being cheated because they were paying for what other people were going through, which obviously wasn't the case. But what this served to do is reinforce the idea that there are the kind of gift-giving Canadians that are, hospitable and they are generous. And then there is the ungrateful, kind of blood-sucking degenerates that are just taking from these hard-working Canadians. So this kind of mind frame that is of Canada, Canadians being bringers of kind of opportunity and kind of gift giving and the kind of parents of the nation. I didn't say that as well as I could have, but anyways, has its roots, Thobani suggests, in what was happening with residential schools. So for those that aren't familiar, Canada has a very rough history with what are called residential schools, where Indigenous kids were taken away from their families and communities and essentially thrown into these boarding schools where she is a stat in here, some 42% of these children would die per year in these schools. Not to mention the fact that many of them were being abused, many of them sexually abused, neglected, all kinds of terrible things in these schools. But these Canadians felt like they were, doing a wonderful thing because and this came about through their process of exaltation, in their exalting themselves. They said, okay, we are civilized. We know we are civilized because we know Indigenous people are not civilized, according to them. So the only humane thing that we could do is, because the parents are a lost cause, take their kids away and put them in these civilizing spaces. And in these civilizing spaces, that is residential schools, they'd be taught the word of God. They'd be taught, other things that European people thought were important. And if a few of them die, it's for the greater cause, which is really fucked up. It was really messed up. And it had detrimental effects. The last, I say to this day, or I would say to this day, but the last residential school closed only in the 90s, I believe, which is absurd and is totally reprehensible. But it wasn't even just that kids were being thrown in these terrible schools. They're being taken from their families, and in some cases adopted by, white families, because they said they believe that, the nuclear family, and the nuclear family is the idea that you have a father, mother, and kids. The nuclear family is the superior form of kind of familial life. And so it was seen as being a kind of beneficial move for people. And there's a really lovely book by Thompson Highway, this is a Indigenous Canadian author, titled Kiss of the Fur Queen, which I highly recommend. It's really good. It follows the story of two Indigenous brothers that are essentially go through this process. And there's a moment in it when one of the brothers, I can't remember which, says, it's really no surprise to me that, these white European settlers are so violent. And he says that it's essentially because it seems to me that it's because their religious kind of iconography is all about violence. And for any of us that have been in a kind of Catholic church, if you're in one of those Catholic churches with all the kind of pictures of the crucifixion that goes through the various processes, like the various stages, of Jesus, being indicted or being given the guilty verdict, and then he's forced to carry the cross and he's whipped and all this stuff. It all centers on violence. So this child makes this revelation that, wow, this is really quite unsurprising then that they act the way they act, in their kind of violent ways, precisely because that's all they know is violence. And then it's from there then that she moves into chapter 4, titled Multiculturalism and the Liberalizing Nation. So this chapter deals specifically with the idea of multiculturalism. So this kind of came about under the Pierre Elliott Trudeau government in the 80s, the early 80s, I believe. And he was a kind of major figure behind Canada as a quote-unquote multicultural nation, where he saw that, and I'm not saying that he was like a mastermind behind this, but there are certain benefits that can be incurred if you sell the image of your nation as being a multicultural hotbed, essentially. Now, this was done in distinction to the kind of American ideal of the melting pot, where people are meant to go and completely ascribe to that identity, like so-called American identity, whatever that is. And that ultimately for Thobani, what multiculturalism did was to kind of politicize racialized bodies, to kind of put them on display so that Canada could say, look at how amazing we are. We take in anyone and they can keep existing as they want to exist. But of course that doesn't address, and this is kind of the main point she wants to get at here, the fact that Canadians, i.e. white people, white Canadians, are the superior in-group, and all others that come are derivative of that. So it's no surprise then, and she makes the claim that this kind of multiculturalism only really was able to emerge when whiteness was kind of grounded as the dominant, race of Canada. Now, this had a particularly strong effect in the post-World War Two period, where Thobani says there was a kind of crisis of European ideals, right, with things like gas chambers and, concentration camps that really threw the idea of, the national identity of, rational people for a loop. It really threw all that off. So Canada was like, well, how about we sell the image of the total opposite of that. That is, we welcome people. But we welcome people for our own benefit. So it's a more effective way at kind of controlling people. And what is more, it serves the end of kind of erasing Canada's violent past with immigrants and Indigenous people, because it says, look how far we've come. Sure, we have this bad past, but let's forget about that. Like, we are better now. And any kind of exceptions to that are simply being conducted by a few like bad apples. So it really can't stand in for the rest of Canada. So how about you just shut up about it and just accept it, because we are, superior now. So this was really effective for Thobani because it kind of served the end of de-radicalizing people. That is, de-radicalizing anti-racist politics. Because Canada could say, look, we're doing all we can. We are the most open country in the world. Therefore, racism doesn't exist here. So you really have nothing to complain about, which is just a way for them to do the bare minimum in order to fly under the radar of any kind of critical gaze, which of course we know is garbage. And this is even internalized by immigrant people who then, having accepted the idea of Canada as an amazing place of opportunity and multicultural identity, these people who will then internalize any kind of pitfall that they experience as their own fault, because they are told that it can't be Canada's fault because Canada is an amazing, wonderful place and Canadians are amazing, wonderful, generous people. And anything that goes wrong has to then, well, you're the only one left, so it's your fault, which is a very effective tool at dissuading critical analyses of, systemic forms of oppression. Because why would you bother if you really believe it's your own fault for something going wrong? And I should add, there's so many consequences to this, that it also served the end. That is, multiculturalism served the end of casting people who wanted things for themselves as backwards, anti-multiculturalism people living in the past. So the example she gives is how when Indigenous people are asking for things for themselves, the Canadian can then have recourse to say, well, what about, you're only thinking about yourself? Like, that is not holding up with Canadian values, which is just a way for, backwards Canada to claim other people are messed up. So there's a very good way, another way to put this, and anyone familiar with Quebec politics, especially language politics in Quebec, would at least find this relevant, I think. But there's a tendency. So let me give a little bit more exposition first. So French laws in Quebec are kind of strict in an effort to kind of maintain, French as the primary language in Quebec, which I think is a good thing. My own opinion. Do with it what you will, because the language is under threat to some extent by like a gigantic culture industry that threatens to take it away. And for my own part, I think French should be maintained in Canada. But anyways, so there is a lot of animosity among English-speaking Quebecers against French-speaking Quebecers, because when French-speaking Quebecers say, we feel like we're under threat from English influence, Canadian Quebecers say, well, you just get over it. Like, you aren't really being under threat. In fact, we are the ones being oppressed because our stop signs now say, the French word for stop is arrête. They now say arrête instead of saying stop. Or it's harder for me to get services in English now in Quebec. So at first glance, it might seem like, okay, yeah, that doesn't really seem fair. But in further investigation, it seems less like these English-speaking Quebecers are concerned about, the rights of other people. And it seems like in many cases a way for English Quebecers to kind of demonize French Quebecers as being, kind of backwards, selfish, only caring about themselves. And especially, this is especially relevant when we consider the thing I mentioned earlier, the kind of Quebec immigration laws, where English Quebecers weaponize that against French-speaking Quebecers to say, well, look at how backwards you are because of the kind of impositions you put on immigrants, which I should say aren't great. But I'm very suspicious because these English Quebecers are not, social justice radicals running out in the streets trying to fight injustice. They don't do any of that. And so we get very suspicious, and then we question, okay, how much of this is actually about, kind of maintaining, or how much of this is about a kind of egalitarian project opposing oppression, and how much of it is about kind of maintaining one's superior status, so English Quebecers trying to maintain a superior status over French Quebecers by demonizing French Quebecers. And I think that the very same thing in how Thobani's describing it here with Canada against Indigenous people, where they say, well, you really have nothing to complain about because we've given you all of this. And the fact that you don't like immigrants coming because they're taking over your land, or, immigrant populations are growing in various places that you see to be your land, is because you're backwards and you haven't ascribed to Canada's multicultural values yet. So really you should check yourself, which is just an effective way for Canada to silence, the needs of various different peoples, especially Indigenous people. Oh, God, okay. It's an aside, a big digression. That puts us here into chapter 5. That is reforming Canadians, consultations, and nationalizations. So this chapter looks at two different kind of policy reviews that went, or two reviews that were undergone. There was what were called the Immigration Policy Review and the Social Security Review. So the Immigration Policy Review is kind of a survey conducted by Canadians, quote unquote Canadians, about, what immigration means to them, which was kind of dealing with it at a cultural level, so the level of values. Whereas the Social Security Review was looking at the way that, in many cases, funds were being allocated to, immigrants and other various things. So the Immigration Policy Review is mostly cultural, whereas the Social Security Review is mostly economic. So these efforts were meant to kind of find ways to improve relationships between immigrants and quote-unquote Canadians. Now, Thobani says that is not the case, because what it essentially did was reinforce the idea that there are Canadians and that there are immigrants, and that there is a clear separation. And she includes a number of testimonies by people that did these surveys or these studies, these reviews, that participated in them. And many of them are very messed up, saying that, like, immigrants coming here don't deserve, like, anything because, they should be happy just to be in, like, Canada, and they shouldn't get any help or anything like that. They shouldn't be coming here at all. Like, there are a number of different messed up ones. And ultimately, most of the people just wanted to ban immigration altogether. Now, this had a kind of interesting, it's terrifying consequence, and that is that it kind of bestowed immigrants with a kind of power that they did not possess. So it was saying that, immigrants are going to come here and screw up Canada in XYZ ways, to which Thobani says that, how is that possible? Like, these immigrants come here in many cases with very little. They aren't exactly going to band together and do these things you say. So it's a kind of, conspiratorial imaginary that motivates these fears as well. But it's fascinating to me, and I don't know why I'm thinking about it, because Thobani only just mentions it briefly, but it's interesting because it casts the other with an authority that they surely do not possess. And it is by virtue of that Canadians are actually able to strengthen themselves by strengthening the other, right? By saying the other poses this threat with their strength, therefore we must be stronger than them. So these reviews essentially reveal that Canadians believed immigrants to be, like, backwards and messed up. And there are a number of different consequences of this, and I'll read one here. So one example, and this doesn't have to do with Canada, but these kinds of questions and stuff for her, quote, bring to mind the behavior of British immigrant officers who demanded in the 70s and 80s that sponsored Asian women undergo virginity tests at airports to prove their commitment to their fiancés who had sponsored them. Just enforcing the idea that, immigrants are conniving, evil, manipulative agents in this world, and that we have to, mobilize an apparatus to combat that. So finally here we get into chapter 6, and that is nationality in the age of global terror. So obviously this is talking about the post-9/11 period, which everyone I assume is familiar with, but in case you aren't, September 11th, 2001, there was a major attack in New York City against the World Trade Center, conducted by people mostly from Saudi Arabia. But it prompted the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Iran, Afghanistan, which makes no sense. But anyways, this provoked a lot of fear in the hearts of many quote-unquote Western people because of the possible threat of, the other. So what this motivated for Thobani was the idea, kind of intensified the idea that the West is best, and that anyone who didn't ascribe to that was backwards. So this is where we get into the idea of, Muslim women being oppressed because of them wearing like a hijab or a niqab or anything like that in the eyes of the Western people, where the mantra that comes from Spivak, the idea that it is up to white men to save brown women from brown men, kind of intensifies. And that is the idea that it is up to the West to kind of rid the world of backwardsness. And Canada was closely tied to this, following United States into the Middle East following 9/11 and helping them with so many other little, military projects across the globe. So the Canadian media in these efforts often serve the end of kind of stoking fears of, the other, even though there were no terrorist acts happening in Canada at all, yet there was starting to grow a general animosity towards that fantastical, spectral enemy that is the terrorist. So it motivated these drives by Canadians to, want to go into various places and blow them up because they somehow had the same characteristics as these so-called terrorists. But this is all very ironic for Thobani because, as I think she correctly identifies, terrorism is often the result of kind of imperialistic efforts. So the example in the United States would be like how the United States, in its role in Afghanistan in the 80s, when Russia was threatening to kind of invade Afghanistan, they armed like everyone there. And then there was the Gulf War, where they essentially, took over the Middle East in search of oil, which all stoked what would become the Taliban that would orchestrate these attacks, or Al-Qaeda. So she says that oftentimes terrorism is a result of imperialistic strategies or imperialistic moves. So then she says that it's ironic that Canada would get involved in this because that would then actually prompt, such things to happen. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that Canada does this, because then if it happens, if there is a terrorist attack in Canada, then, they can say, look at the threat that was there. Thank God we were doing all we did, not ever considering the possibility that it is precisely because they engaged in these kind of imperialistic efforts that they prompted such a response. Now, Thobani isn't naive. She also recognizes that Canada couldn't very well just say, actually, no, we're not going to get involved with this, because then that would, create tensions between, them and the United States and other countries in the quote-unquote West. So, she wants to recognize that as well, but she does that to recognize that it's a much bigger problem than just like Canada itself. And the other, obviously the consequence of that has been the rise of violence against Muslim people, at least Muslim-appearing people, all across North America. Like the various terrorist attacks that happened in Quebec that I mentioned against the mosque, or what we saw in New Zealand with the Christchurch incident. I just called that an incident, that terrible tragedy. And then it is from there that we get into the conclusion, where she says, kind of repeats the essence of the book, all the key points, but I want to highlight that she says that we must first understand that violence committed against non-white people, that is in many cases racialized bodies, these aren't like fringe ultra-conservatives doing these things. These are, it's part of our identity to oppose anything that is not, white in many cases. And she says that if one thing that we have to do to kind of begin this process is to obviously dismantle this exaltation status, which can only really come about in the case of Canada if we kind of develop our connection to Indigenous people, because, these people are right here, and we have we owe it to them to really put in an effort to make amends for all the violence committed against them in the first step to combat exaltation as being a thing at all, but that white people are the only ones that are considered like real, Canadians. But yeah, that pretty well encapsulates it, I guess. I guess a shout out here to Laim, Laim, my patron, who right now is donating quite a bit. And for anyone else that can, I would certainly appreciate it. But yeah, on that note, I hope you got something out of this. If not, or if you have any problem with what I did, you know how to tell me. But yeah, take it easy.